earliest known date is in the mid-1800s, when the great-grandfather of Ira Woodruff, who was a Methodist minister, noticed that his people were becoming very lax in what he termed in keeping the Lord's Day, which that meant to them was on Sunday. Well, he felt it was his solemn duty to correct his people and get them to become more serious about keeping the day as they should. And as he studied the subject more and more deeply, he began to realize that they were keeping the wrong day.
I remember, the things I remember mostly about him is how it was his spiritual life away from the church. He would, of a morning, he would get up and, not so much in the morning, but in the afternoon when he'd sit down, he'd open up his Bible and sit there and read his Bible for an hour, 30 minutes to an hour. And then I'd see him when I was out in the field, when I was a teenager, that he would stop and kneel and pray during the daytime. I've seen these things out of my granddad. And those things is what is, that part of his spiritual life I remember. And he was always a man that to get up and do his work and stuff in life. He was always a very humble person. One of his favorite sermons was on the Ten Commandments.
At that time, the people were meeting in the home of Brother Charles Monroe on Elm Street. And on March the 28th, 1925, Elder L.I. Rogers and F.C. Robinson came and officially organized the church as part of the Stanberry organization. The following is a direct quotation from the minutes of that meeting and reads as follows. Fort Smith, March 28, 1925. At 7:30 p.m., Elder F.C. Robinson assembled the others at Brother C.H. Monroe's residence, and after singing praises to God and asking His guidance and blessings upon us, and reading from His Word. Signing of the members, Elder Robinson organized the Church of God at Fort Smith, and consisting of the following members: Brother and Sister C.H. Monroe, Brother and Sister Burley Lewis, Brother and Sister L.S. Robinson, Brother and Sister G.D. Lewis, and Brother and Sister W.N. Woodruff. These all uniting on professing the faith, having been previously baptized. Elder Robinson officiated in ordaining C.H. Monroe, elder, and G.D. Lewis, deacon.
Well, Grandpa L.I. and Mabel, my grandmother, he was a district overseer and lived in Nebraska, but he would come fairly regular and visit. And I can't remember the topic of his sermons, but he did a lot on prophecy, and that would interest me in the end-time events. And did a lot of study along those lines. So it got me interested in, but he was always a good influence, good role model, shall we say. And my grandmother, she would always project what I thought to be the perfect wife. She was always supportive of him in the ministry.
And by March of 1930, 2 years later, there was 20 who partake of the Lord's Supper, and there were 13 children present. in 2 years, is quite a growth. Sister Sarah Ann Robinson initiated the fulfillment of that plan by telling the people that she and her husband would donate a lot for such a church if the congregation would build on it. In the early 1930s, he donated a lot which became known as 3918 Waldron Road. The building was dedicated on January the 10th, 1931. Record shows that Elder C.Y. Monroe was the first pastor of the church, but that Elder R.A. Barnes was the first elected pastor, and how long Elder Barnes served was not clear. On April 10th, 1934, the church was reorganized due to a split that took place in the parent organization. Elder Enos Hawkins was in charge of that reorganization. 5 years later, in 1939, Elder Dal Snow became the pastor until October of 1942.
My grandmother, I remember, her name was Viva Samples, and we called her Nanny. So Nanny was out in her field one day, and she said a minister came riding by on horseback, and he stopped, and they just chatted over the fence, and they got to talking about the Bible, and they started comparing what they believed, and everything that they would bring up they had in common. That they right down the line, the Sabbath, clean and unclean, state of the dead, different, any topic they came up with. And so that was my nanny's first introduction to the Church of God. She did not attend at Fort Smith, but right across the road from where they lived was a little schoolhouse. It was called the Philadelphia Schoolhouse. And they would have church there on Sabbath. A few families would meet. And a few miles away, there was another building called the 43 School, or I'm not sure it was a school, but anyway, they just referred to it as the 43 Church. And they would also meet there. And so she began attending those places in like the maybe 1930s, right in there, early 1930. Then later, she attended at Moffett, which is just across the river from Fort Smith. And there was a church that met there for a number of years, all Sabbath keeping, all related to COG7. And eventually, when I was about 4 or 5 years old, they switched and started attending in Fort Smith. So that was has been my church for as far back. I don't remember attending Moffett. I just remember them telling me that I did. I do remember going out to 43 because we would still go there for singings and revival services and things like that. One of my earliest memories is probably not a true memory, it's just that I have a picture to see, but when we would have our potluck services, the men would carry the wooden pews out and turn them to face each other, made kind of a U shape, and that's where they set all the food, and you just reached over the back of the pew and filled your plates up, and then sat down on the grass or went back inside the church, because at that time, there was only the one room, just the sanctuary.
Following his term, Elder Jesse Rogers pastored the church for 16 years. Elder Rogers, or Uncle Jesse, as he was called later, served twice later as an interim pastor from June of 62 till June of 63, and again from 68 to 1970, following the deaths of Elder Burge and Elder Harlan.
I think looking back, one thing that has been very consistent is we have managed to have strong leadership, a strong board throughout all of those years, regardless who our pastors were. Yesterday we heard from a couple of interns, and one in particular who said coming here was not his idea. He had served a ministry and it did not go well. His pastorate did not go well at all. And it was an attempt to save his ministry that he was sent here to serve. And he served under Elder Wesley Walker, but I think it also had to do a lot with the board we had, because we have a very strong and stable board. So we've had some ministers have been better than others, as would be expected. We're all human. But throughout that time, we've had a very consistent and stable board that has kept things running smoothly. The times when we didn't have a pastor, and we had much that time we had Elder Jesse Rogers, our current pastor's uncle, who would fill in whenever he was needed. But there never was any doubt about the church continuing and growing. It's always been very secure throughout the years.
Elder E.A. Chandler became the next pastor on January the 10th, 1959, and pastored the church for about 9 months. Elder R.E. Burge came to pastor the church in the latter part of 1959 and was pastor until his death in 1962. It was during his pastorate that the radio program began, which continued for about 10 years. January of 1963, Elder Ivan Harlan became pastor and continued in that role until his death, November the 13th, 1968. Elder Calvin Burrell, who began his ministry in Fort Smith on July the 18th in 1970 and continued until July the 28th in 1973, and when he resigned to return to Springville to be a teacher.
Calvin and Barbara were very, very pleased to be here in Fort Smith, and they came to visit us several times after we moved here.
During his tenure as pastor, Elder Burrell also served as National FYC Director, which made for a very active FYC program here. We have evidence of a lot of awards that our local FYC won during his tenure here.
The continual perseverance of individuals that led the church over time, starting with the first pastor or the first leader that started through tough times and through good times, they just continued. And I saw that in my home church in Fairview. I see that here. It just takes a few motivated leaders or willing to be a leader to keep the momentum.
Elder Marvin Kima assumed the pastorate on August the 25th, 1973, and continued into July 1974. In August of 1974, Elder Wesley Walker became pastor, a role he maintained through August of 1991.
Well, I feel like Wesley Walker was really got the doctrinal points just pretty much right down the line, would really got those clearly spelled out.
At the July 1977 business meeting, the congregation voted to officially begin forming plans to construct a larger facility that would better serve the growing number of children in the congregation. Now, however, that dream was not easily recognized. The first challenge was locating an affordable and appropriate building site. Multiple locations were considered before being discarded due to excessive costs and failure to meet the building needs of the church. After 1 year of prayer, fasting, and searching, a 3-acre building site was finally secured at a cost of $25,000. That's the 3 acres we're sitting on here today. Elder Kyle Hall moved to Fort Smith and served as a pastor from August of 91 through May of 93, before deciding to leave the ministry and return to the secular work. Eileen and I moved here from Southern California. Now, when I went in and got my full-time license, I put down 1 year, 2 year, 5 years, 10-year goals. My 10-year goal was to be the pastor in Fort Smith, Arkansas, and retire there. In 7 years, I was a pastor here.
I will say that I think under our current pastor, Don Rogers, we are more outgoing and reaching out to our community more than we ever had. Before, we've always been good, I think, at taking care of our own. If a member were sick or had difficulties, we would try to help that. But now we've reached out more to the homeless and the needy, and reaching more even to our own congregation's needs through our Homes for Life program. And then we had our Bread of Life program that we ran it from the mid-'80s up to the end of 2021, where we provided groceries for the needy in the area. And for many years, we even provided a church service. When they would come, they had the option of coming in and singing, and Pastor Don would lead prayer, and he'd have a short message devotion for them, and they really enjoyed it. It was not required, and not all came in, but then the government said, no, you can't do that. You can't have any religious service with it. And many people were very disappointed when we had to stop that. But it was a matter of stopping that or stopping the whole program. So
I had a different vision of what the pastor, what he should teach. Previously, there'd been a lot of emphasis on prophecy, end-time events. My theory and my vision was that if people are not living right today, it don't matter what the prophecies fulfill. So my goal has been to teach people how to live today in order that they be on the right side when Christ does return. And that was some rocky road times when people said, well, why don't you ever preach on prophecy? I said, well, you had about all the sermons there is on prophecy. You should know prophecy. And I want you to be prepared when all these things happen. And when God's finished with me, I can be sitting here talking to you and kill over. But I'm going to keep working. I'm 83 years old and don't plan on retiring, because when God's finished with me, then I know I'm finished. But in the meantime, I want to keep striving to keep ministering to God, because I know it's touching someone. If it's encouraging even one person every Sabbath, whatever. But my goal is to minister as long as I can, as long as I have breath.